What if one morning the money just stopped? Not your money, the government's. Salaries frozen, hospitals without supplies, schools shutting their doors, airports grounded, millions waiting for payments that never arrive. It sounds like science fiction, but it's a scenario that's played out again and again in different corners of the world. From Wall Street boardrooms to small-town streets, when a government runs out of cash, no one escapes the impact. And here's the part no one tells you. Sometimes the warning signs come years in advance. Other times, it happens overnight. Today, you'll discover what really happens when a government runs out of money. When people hear the phrase, "the government is running out of money," most imagine something dramatic. Vaults running empty, trucks loaded with cash fleeing the capital. But the reality is far more technical and far more dangerous. Running out of money for a government doesn't mean running out of physical bills. It means something much simpler and far more lethal: the inability to meet its financial obligations on time. At its core, a government functions like a giant cash flow machine. Every day, money comes in and money goes out. Taxes, fees, bond issuances, all flowing in one direction. Salaries, pensions, debt payments, healthcare funding flowing in the other. On paper, the system looks infinite, but in reality, it's not. There's a daily balance, and when that balance drops below critical levels, decisions must be made fast. The first sign of trouble is liquidity stress. Not a budget deficit, not total debt. Liquidity, the short-term ability to pay what's due today, this week, this month. At quiet rooms inside finance ministries and treasuries, teams monitor this flow like air traffic controllers watching crowded skies. They track incoming revenue, outgoing payments, and market reactions to every policy move. When revenue slows or borrowing capacity tightens, the countdown begins. The first response is almost always invisible to the public. Governments start delaying non-essential payments. Contractors stop receiving funds. Infrastructure projects freeze. Internal spending caps are enforced, quietly, without announcement. Next, discretionary programs get cut. Travel budgets, grants, public campaigns, anything that won't cause immediate political backlash. But as cash reserves continue to shrink, the decisions get harder. Essential services face shortfalls. Healthcare providers wait for reimbursements. Pension funds request transfers that aren't coming. Local governments stop receiving federal support. All of this happens before a single headline appears. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, another priority takes control: debt service. Failing to pay bondholders isn't just embarrassing, it triggers automatic penalties across global financial systems. Credit downgrades, interest rate spikes, frozen lines of credit. To avoid this, most governments in crisis will sacrifice almost everything else just to stay current on debt payments. This is when the public starts noticing. Delayed tax refunds, unpaid government salaries, shutdowns of public services, slowdowns in courts, licensing offices, and regulatory bodies. Media outlets begin asking questions. Officials release carefully worded statements, temporary adjustments, cash flow realignments, short-term liquidity measures, always minimizing, always buying time. But beneath the surface, panic grows. Markets start adjusting risk premiums on that country's debt. Credit default swaps spike. International lenders tighten conditions. Currency markets react. Internally, central banks and finance ministries scramble. They explore emergency borrowing, short-term debt rollovers, asset sales, sometimes even quietly topping sovereign wealth funds or pension reserves. And then comes the red line. If all internal maneuvers fail and the government physically cannot make a scheduled payment, the situation shifts from liquidity crisis to technical default. That's the point where the system can no longer hide the truth. Payments stop, creditors react, legal actions begin, and the global financial system recalibrates the value of that nation's signature. This process doesn't happen overnight. It builds, decision by decision, cover-up by cover-up, until the math becomes undeniable. Because in the end, governments don't run out of money the way individuals do. They run out of options, they run out of credibility, and finally, they run out of time. But to really understand how close every country is to this point, you first need to understand how government money actually moves. For most people, government money feels like an endless resource, a constant, unshakable flow that funds salaries, hospitals, roads, schools, defense, and debt payments, all at once. But behind that illusion is a fragile, high-pressure system of cash flow management operating on a razor-thin margin of error. At the center of it is something most citizens have never heard of: the government's daily cash position. Every day, before the sun rises, teams inside Treasury departments run projections. They calculate how much revenue will arrive in the next 24 hours and how much cash is scheduled to go out. Taxes, customs duties, fees, and short-term borrowing on one side. Salaries, pensions, healthcare transfers, supplier payments, debt interest, and social benefits on the other. It's not a monthly calculation. It's not even weekly. It's daily, sometimes hourly. The government operates like a giant corporate treasury, but with infinitely higher stakes. If a payment is missed, it's not a supplier complaining. It's a bond market collapsing. To manage this, most countries rely on two primary tools: incoming revenue and short-term borrowing capacity. Revenue is the predictable part: taxes, fees, and income from state-owned enterprises. But revenue arrives in waves. Some days, there's a flood. Others, almost nothing. To cover the gaps, governments issue short-term debt, treasury bills, overnight loans, market-based instruments designed to smooth out the flow. And this is where the danger begins. If investors lose confidence, if demand for short-term government debt falls, liquidity dries up fast. And when that happens, there's no backup credit card, no emergency overdraft. Central banks can step in, but even that comes with risks: inflation, currency devaluation, loss of market credibility. Most people assume that governments have massive cash reserves for moments like this. They don't. Holding too much idle cash would mean borrowing more, paying more interest, creating more debt. So most treasuries operate with minimal buffer, enough to cover days, sometimes weeks, but rarely more. This is why timing is everything. A single delayed tax inflow, a failed debt auction, or an unexpected spike in spending can throw the entire system off balance. And when that happens, the government enters what insiders call cash management crisis mode. This is when priorities shift from policy to survival. Finance ministers and treasury secretaries start holding emergency calls with central banks and major creditors. Spending committees freeze discretionary disbursements. Internal task forces are formed, tasked with one mission: keep the government solvent until the next inflow. Decisions become tactical. Which payments are politically sensitive? Which can be delayed without causing immediate backlash? Which creditors can tolerate a few extra days without triggering penalties? And perhaps the most dangerous question of all: how long can we keep this hidden before the markets notice? Because once the markets sense liquidity stress, the cost of borrowing skyrockets. Investors demand higher yields to compensate for the risk. Refinancing debt becomes exponentially more expensive, and the spiral accelerates. This is why when a government approaches a shutdown or default, the internal crisis starts long before the public hears about it. It begins with liquidity models showing red flags. It escalates with silent payment delays. And it explodes when the system runs out of tricks. Understanding how government money moves is understanding why no country, no matter how wealthy, can escape the fundamental law of finance. Cash always runs faster than promises. And when the gap between the two gets too wide, what feels like a political dispute quickly turns into a full-scale economic emergency. To most people, the words shutdown and default sound like the same thing. Government crisis, payments stopped, services frozen. But inside the system, they mean two very different kinds of failure. A shutdown is political. A default is financial. One is a choice. The other, a collapse. Let's start with the shutdown. A government shutdown happens when lawmakers fail to approve the legal authority to spend money. It's not that the money isn't there, it's that the government doesn't have permission to use it. The budget hasn't been passed, the appropriations haven't been signed. Legally, the Treasury can't disburse funds. During a shutdown, essential services continue. Military operations, air traffic control, emergency health care, but everything else starts shutting down by law. National parks close, passport offices stop processing, public employees are sent home without pay. It's a forced paralysis driven by politics, not insolvency. A shutdown damages public trust. It slows the economy. It creates chaos. But the moment a budget deal is reached, the government turns back on. Salaries get paid retroactively. Services resume. It's disruption, embarrassing, expensive, but it's reversible. Default is different. A default happens when a government, even with full legal authority to spend, simply doesn't have the money to meet its financial obligations. It's not a political standoff. It's a liquidity failure, or worse, a solvency crisis. The government misses a payment on its bonds. It fails to pay interest to creditors. It delays repayment of principal. And once that happens, the consequences cascade globally. Credit rating agencies trigger automatic downgrades. Borrowing costs skyrocket overnight. Investors around the world dump that country's debt. Banks with exposure to government bonds take losses. Pension funds, mutual funds, central banks all take a hit. Worse, the legal framework kicks in. Bondholders can sue. Asset freezes become possible. International trade lines tighten. Unlike a shutdown, a default doesn't end with a political handshake. It ends with restructuring, debt renegotiation, or, in severe cases, years of economic isolation. History is full of governments that crossed this line. Argentina in 2001, Greece in 2012, Russia in 1998. Each with its own trigger, each with its own consequences. None of them walked away without scars. And there's one more layer most people miss. A country can experience both at the same time. A political deadlock triggering a shutdown can snowball into a liquidity crunch that leads to default. What starts as a legal fight over budgets can turn into a financial event with global reach. And that is why inside finance ministries, there's one rule that stays unspoken but universally understood. You can survive a shutdown. You don't survive a default. For most citizens, the idea of a government running out of money feels distant, theoretical, something that only happens in textbooks. But history tells a different story. This has happened before. In developed countries, in emerging economies, in nations considered too big to fail, until they did. Let's start with one of the most cited examples, Argentina, 2001. After years of economic mismanagement, debt accumulation, and currency manipulation, Argentina reached a point where it could no longer meet its obligations. On December 23rd, the government officially defaulted on over $100 billion in sovereign debt, at the time the largest sovereign default in history. The immediate fallout was brutal. Banks froze withdrawals. Middle-class citizens lost access to their own savings overnight. The peso collapsed. Unemployment surged. And in less than 2 weeks, Argentina went through 5 different presidents. The social contract disintegrated in real time. But Argentina wasn't alone. Russia, 1998. Despite being one of the world's largest energy exporters, Russia defaulted on its domestic debt and devalued the ruble. Global investors, including major Wall Street firms, suffered massive losses. The ripple effect reached international hedge funds, triggering the collapse of long-term capital management, a major U.S.-based fund, forcing the U.S. Federal Reserve to intervene. Then there was Greece, 2012. After years of hidden deficits and creative accounting to meet Eurozone entry criteria, Greece's debt became unsustainable. When markets stopped buying Greek bonds, the country lost access to credit. The European Union and the IMF stepped in, but not before Greece entered a formal default process on some of its bonds. The price of that rescue? Austerity measures that slashed pensions, wages, and social programs, and a decade-long economic depression. Even the United States has flirted with disaster. In 2011, and again in 2013, political standoffs over the debt ceiling brought the U.S. government within hours of missing payments. During the 2011 crisis, Standard & Poor's downgraded the U.S. credit rating for the first time in history. The cost of borrowing increased by billions overnight. Markets plunged, investor confidence shook, and even though a technical default was avoided, the damage to America's fiscal reputation lingered for years. There's a pattern in all these cases. It never starts with an official announcement. It starts with quiet delays, missed signals, ignored warnings, then liquidity stress, then missed payments, and finally, a full-blown crisis. By the time the public hears the word default, the system has already been bleeding for months. And here's the most uncomfortable truth for any modern government. Once you cross that line, getting back is almost impossible. The market doesn't forget. Creditors don't forgive. And trust, once lost, doesn't return with a press conference. A missed government payment seems small at first. A delayed transfer, an unpaid invoice, one line in one ledger on one day. But inside financial systems, nothing happens in isolation. The moment a government misses an obligation, whether it's a bond payment, a supplier invoice, or a public salary, a chain reaction begins. First, creditors adjust their models. Risk spreads widen. Bond yields jump. Credit rating agencies issue warnings or downgrades. The government's cost of borrowing instantly increases. That alone creates a trap, because higher borrowing costs mean more debt service pressure, making the next round of payments even harder to meet. Next, institutional investors start moving. Pension funds, insurance companies, and mutual funds holding government bonds reduce exposure. They dump the bonds, driving market prices down and pushing yields even higher. Foreign investors pull capital out of the country. The national currency weakens, sometimes catastrophically. A weaker currency triggers another round of damage. Imported goods become more expensive, fuel prices rise, inflation surges, consumer purchasing power collapses. For households, it starts with food prices, utility bills, transportation costs. For businesses, supply chains fracture, operating costs spike, margins vanish. Meanwhile, the banking sector starts to bleed. Banks holding government debt as collateral suddenly see the value of their assets drop. Liquidity tightens. Interbank lending slows. Some institutions stop lending altogether, even to each other. Access to credit vanishes for small businesses and consumers. The economy slows, then contracts. Unemployment rises. As the crisis deepens, the political system comes under pressure. Protests escalate, strikes spread, governments lose legitimacy, sometimes they fall. And behind it all, international lenders, credit rating agencies, and financial markets watch and wait, deciding how much more damage they're willing to absorb before cutting the country off completely. What started as a single missed payment becomes a full-scale economic, social, and political crisis. And the final irony? In most cases, the cost of managing the fallout from default ends up being many times larger than the original payment that was missed. Because financial systems don't punish governments for running out of money, they punish them for losing control. Even when a government avoids a shutdown or a default at the last possible second, the damage is already done. Because in the world of finance, perception is currency. Every close call leaves a scar on a country's reputation. Investors remember, rating agencies document, bond markets adjust. The first and most obvious cost is financial. Just the threat of default is enough to increase a nation's borrowing costs for years. Even a short-lived crisis can add billions in additional interest payments over the next decade. Lenders now see the country as a higher-risk borrower, and with every future bond issuance, investors will demand a premium to compensate for that risk. The second cost is institutional. Inside government agencies, months of crisis management replace long-term planning. Budgets shrink, projects stall, talent leaves. Experienced public servants, tired of operating in permanent emergency mode, move to the private sector. The institutional memory that keeps bureaucracies functional erodes. The third is social. Citizens lose trust. Even if services resume and salaries get paid, the psychological damage lingers. People start questioning the system. They delay big purchases. They save more, spend less, slowing economic recovery. Business owners postpone investments. Banks tighten lending standards. The consumer economy drags. And there's a fourth cost, harder to measure, but even more dangerous: credibility at the international level. Future trade partners, foreign investors, international agencies all take note. The country's risk profile is now permanently altered, and this creates a new kind of trap, because every future crisis becomes harder and more expensive to solve. The government finds itself stuck in a cycle: higher borrowing costs, leaner budgets, weaker institutions, lower growth, and, inevitably, higher political instability. Each crisis leaves the system more fragile and more vulnerable to the next one. And perhaps the most dangerous part is that from the outside, everything still looks normal until it doesn't. Because once a country earns the label of unreliable borrower, it's almost impossible to earn it back. Governments don't collapse in a single day. They erode, quietly, transaction by transaction, decision by decision, until one morning, The money simply isn't there. By then, it's not just a fiscal problem. It's a trust problem, a credit problem, a political problem, a social fracture that no bailout can fix. Because the real question, the one no government ever answers publicly, isn't how much money do we have left? It's this: how long can we keep people believing that we do?